Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me.
Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire, a critical essay in the recent edition of the well-known magazine Foreign Affairs raises a fundamental question about India-US relations. It asks, are these relations really based on shared values, as the two countries repeatedly insist? Or are they in fact based upon convenience and shared interests? And if it is the latter, what are the implications and consequences for India-US relations? The name of the article is India as It Is, Washington and New Delhi Share Interests, Not Values. And its author is a senior advisor in the South Asia program at the United States Institute of Peace, Daniel Markey. Joining me live now from Washington, D.C. is Dr. Markey himself. Dr. Markey, before we come to details and the argument you present in your Foreign Affairs article, let me in fact start and alert the audience with what I believe is the key point you make. You argue that the claim India-US relations are built upon shared values and a shared commitment to democracy is more or less false and misleading. You believe this is in fact a relationship of mutual convenience or what you call shared material interests. As I said, before I come to details and discuss your argument, can I confirm for the audience this is the essential key point you're making?
Yeah, and first of all, let me say thank you for the opportunity to join you today. It's a real pleasure. But I think you've got it basically right. If I could clarify a little bit, I would just suggest that the argument begins with the observation that for Americans, and remember, this is an American magazine with a wide American readership, but it begins with the argument that for Americans, the expectation of shared values has been at the heart for a long time of the US impulse for building a closer partnership with India. And that's not a new story. That's an old story. But it's never been especially right. That expectation has always had caveats, has always had stumbles along the way. And it's even less right now under the leadership of Narendra Modi in India, because I believe that India is less democratic now. And so Americans should wake up to that reality, is the core of the argument. At the same time, however, we have really important shared interests with India. And if anything, those shared interests are more significant and apparent right now than they have been at almost any other point in history. And so it's the sort of this distinction between values and interests that I'm trying to draw, and again, principally for an American audience.
Let's then, against that background, come to the details and arguments you present which bring you to this conclusion. First, you write, India's status as a democracy has become increasingly suspect. You say India's authoritarian, India muzzles the press and silences opposition figures, and it's seen an upsurge in violence directed at its Muslim minority. So first of all, it's not a liberal democracy like America, and increasingly India is majoritarian rather than secular in its behavior. Is that a point you're making?
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. I think that certainly I'm not alone. Many Americans, including your viewers, should see a letter just recently written by members of the U.S. Congress to the Biden administration. But many are concerned about human rights and minority protections in India right now. And this concern is particularly strongly felt about the Muslim community, but other minorities, and repression by the Indian state. And that raises questions about India's representation of minorities and the diversity within its leadership, and what that means more broadly for democratic representation. But there are also other problems that we're concerned about in terms of freedoms associated with the press, with investigative reporting, and with sort of academic freedoms. All of these raise questions about the accountability of the Indian state to its people. And those are mainly problems for the people of India. And I'm not from India. And so at some level, I'm a bit removed from this. And yet, I would suggest that there are many Americans who are still concerned about them. They're concerned for reasons of sort of their interest in universal rights and universal freedoms. So that's not true just for India, but for countries around the world. But I think they are and should be concerned about these changes because, foreign policy begins at home. And how India acts internationally is driven in part by its domestic politics and by the character of its domestic politics. And, domestic politics affect the aims or the aspirations of any state. They affect the ability of that state to be unified in achieving those aspirations. And they affect the way that states make decisions about foreign policy and how accountable they are to their own people. And I think Americans in particular need to see all of that as they contemplate a closer relationship with this India, because if this India is less democratic, I think it will be a less capable and less effective partner for the United States.
In fact, you take this very point one step further, and this time, the way you build on it does have direct implications for the Biden administration. You're right. India is not an ally in the fight for global democracy. And the clear implication is that you seem to be questioning whether India should be part of Biden's Conference of Democracies. And even though Prime Minister Modi has attended 2 such conferences, the question is, does he really belong there?
Yeah. Well, let me begin with an observation that I'm not terribly wild about the Democracy Summit in concept or really in reality, because I think what it principally puts an emphasis on is who's invited and who is not, and who shows up. And I think there are lots of other ways that the Biden administration could have gone about the project of trying to build up sort of like-minded democratic partners around the world, to encourage struggling democracies, to help champions of democracy, and even to help strong democracies get even stronger. I don't think that the summit was necessarily the best way to do that, because the first and last question that most people ask is who was there and who was not. India has been there, and in a period of kind of democratic backsliding, this raises questions about why was India invited and not some other country. But beyond that, I'm also concerned that I believe that Prime Minister Modi has used these democracy summits to cement or legitimize his position as a Democrat in good standing, and to make this argument about India being the as he would put it, the mother of democracy in the world. And all of that would be fine for an Indian leader who was also a champion of democratic values at home. And that's where I think there's a serious disconnect. So I think, the Democracy Summit has deep flaws generally, and then specifically has been used to purposes I'm not happy about by India.
Now, a second point you make in that Foreign Affairs article is about differences between India and America over key policies that matter to Washington. You say India has never joined a Washington-led trade agreement. India has sold weapons to the military junta that ousted Myanmar's democratic government in 2021. And perhaps most importantly of all, India has refused to entertain any economic restrictions against Russia. In fact, India hasn't criticized Russia for the invasion of Ukraine. Instead, it buys cheap Russian oil. And I think the point you're making is that these are such major divergences. They clearly suggest the values the two countries espouse cannot be the same.
Yeah, that is right, to some degree. I guess what I was really trying to emphasize here is the extent to which India and the United States have seen the world through different lenses repeatedly and continue to do so. Now, had I been writing this piece principally for an Indian audience, I would have probably chosen some other examples. I mean, I think Indians would have pointed out the United States' long attraction and support to Pakistan, for instance, which is something that runs against, because of Pakistan's behavior, because of its autocracy, its dictatorial rule over many years, runs to some degree against American values. And I think Indians would have highlighted that. So I think, for my audience, I wanted to just point out the ways in which our worldviews have been different. Now, I think there's two things going on here. First is a general observation that you can both be democracies. There can be two democracies who don't see the world exactly the same way. So democracy in and of itself, though important, doesn't naturally incline states who might have different other interests, would be located in different places at different levels of development and so on, to see the world differently. But beyond that, if our values, that is, if US and Indian values diverge even further from one another, then we have even less reason to anticipate that over time, our interests or our worldviews will converge, right? So if democracy in and of itself isn't enough to ensure similarity of worldview or identical worldviews, diverging worldviews are likely to make that problem even worse. And so my conclusion out of all of this is, look, if we don't see eye to eye on a variety of really big issues, why not just focus on the things where we do see eye to eye, those narrow sets of material interests, which I think are actually quite important. That could still be a pretty rich and realistic agenda. And it's an area where we're less likely to be disappointed over time and disillusioned with one another, because on those big ticket values-based ideas, we haven't always seen exactly eye to eye, and I worry that we may diverge further.
The point you're making, in essence, if I can put it like this, is that if your worldviews diverge and don't converge, on top of the fact that your democratic values are drifting further and further apart, then the second point, in a sense, is compounding the first.
Exactly right. Exactly
now,
right.
You make one further point about India, which, to my mind, as I read your essay, once again questions whether the Indian government's values are the same as those of the Biden administration. You write, India's Hindu nationalism at home also leads the country to promote illiberal aims abroad. Hindu nationalists believe that India should be a sprawling civilizational power, and many of them say they want to create Akhand Bharat, which you define as territory stretching from Afghanistan to Myanmar and Sri Lanka to Tibet. This irredentism clearly raises questions once again, doesn't it, about India's political values and beliefs and the extent to which they converge or actually diverge from American values and beliefs.
Yeah. As I say, at some level, foreign policy, any state's foreign policy, begins at home. And it begins with the question, I think, of how leaders in that state perceive the world and what they want to achieve in it. And it's my sense that, if we ask the question, what does an India that is governed by a Hindu nationalist leadership want in the world? At the very least, we have to begin with the observation that it's probably something different from what a different type of Indian leadership would want in the world. And this Akhand Bharat business, is the kind of thing that's, it's imprecise at the moment. It's difficult to tell precisely what Indian leaders mean by it. It's already upsetting some of India's neighbors, including Nepal, because they don't really understand whether this means an Indian long-term plan for some kind of conquest or extension of India's borders, or whether it means something much less than that. But they worry about it. And, if we look back in other historical cases of rising powers in the world, we look at the United States. We had an ideology at one point, manifest destiny, this sense that America was somehow destined to extend its reach across the continent, which is now the United States, and then beyond, and perhaps into other places like the Philippines and so on. And at first, that was just a kind of a dream or a national mythology. But over time, that became something that was, in a way, that guided policy. If you look at China and you go back to the 1920s and 1930s, you'll see that there were maps of China, which at the time, China's borders were much less extensive than they are now. They didn't include parts of Western China or Tibet. And those maps were, at that time, intended to offer a cautionary tale about what happens when China is not unified, when it's divided within, and how it can lose its territory. And it was suggested that, if China were to become united, that would make it stronger. It wasn't necessarily a sign that China would naturally extend its borders, its actual physical borders, to the full extent that it has, but over time, those maps took on a certain reality for nationalist China. And now the claim is that all of Xinjiang and Tibet has been and forever will be a part of China. So these maps and national mythologies, I think, are important. They can be worrisome. And so Akhund Bharat follows, I think, in a questionable historical kind of category that may worry, and I think is already worrying, India's neighbors. But if I can make one quick other point, it would be, we don't have to look at this particular example as the only example where ideology will affect India's behavior in the world. There's a much simpler one, which is, I think that Hindu nationalists will be less inclined than other Indians even to perceive that the type of world order that has been in play for a long time, kind of a U.S. Western-backed world order, serves India's purposes. I think that this leadership will see that as constraining or confining and not in India's interests. And I think that Americans in particular should be aware of that, should recognize that reality, that this isn't a natural convergence of worldviews, even on the issue of a liberal international world order.
Finally, while we're still talking about the arguments that support and lead to your conclusion, you also have something quite important to say about Narendra Modi. You seem to question whether he's the sort of leader who should be a natural ally of an American president. You call his government an unsavory government. You call him an ethno-nationalist who tolerates little dissent. And to be honest, that is a view of Modi that was expressed in the last 1 week, both by the Washington Post in your city, but also by The Economist in England. And once again, what you're saying is that if you are going to believe that you share values, then surely there should also be a similarity in the types of people who hold those values. And Modi doesn't look like the sort of man Biden would see himself and his own values in.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think that as this visit is upcoming, and Prime Minister Modi will be here meeting with Biden, I think there'll be a tendency in a lot of the media to play up their similarities. Both of them come from modest means. Both of them are hardworking. Both of them are skilled politicians. Both of them are dedicated at some level to bringing certain material advantages to less well-off members of their society. And that's a great narrative. I think it'll sell well. I think it'll do well. But I think it misses a lot of the history that actually distinguishes the two men. And in particular, I think it misses the entire history of Narendra Modi's upbringing within the RSS and then the BJP, his rise through those organizations, the meanings of those organizations. I think, frankly, most Americans are unaware of the even existence of the RSS, certainly not of its ties historically and its origins in the 1920s and 30s to other nationalistic, even fascist organizations, certainly illiberal ideology. And I think this is something that is widely recognized and known in India, but not in the United States. And so I think it's important that somebody sort of point out these differences between the two men and between their ideologies.
Now, against this background, Dr. Markey, you ask a critical question in that essay. The question is how far Washington should go. And if I'm right, I think this is your answer. Rather than considering India an ally in the fight for global democracy, the US must see India as an ally of convenience. It must remain keenly aware that India's desire to work with the United States is born of circumstance, not conviction, and could quickly disappear. And again, if I read you correctly, you're really calling for a significant rethinking of the relationship. It's not common values, common democracy, common principle and belief. It's common interest and convenience, and it will only continue while those remain common.
Yes, I am suggesting there should at least be a refocusing of the relationship. Rather than building a relationship on a kind of a grand hope or an ambition or a promise of the future that is founded on a sense or an assumption of shared values, we should focus on these tangible material interests. And part of the reason why I suggest this is because we should at least remember, if you don't remember our deep history, we should at least remember what has happened over the past 5 years. And we should appreciate that, India's great and greater enthusiasm for partnership with the United States has come about in part, I think in large part, because of its concerns about China and its immediate concerns about China. And this is not a values shift or a fundamental ideological shift. This is an interest shift on India's part. This is a recognition that China has posed an increasing threat along India's border, and that India needs big and important partners and better allies, or at least friends like the United States. And I don't think that that's a shift born of intention in New Delhi. I think that's a shift that's been born of a practical reality. I think that ideally, in the minds of India's leaders today, they might happily return to a world that looked more like before 2017 or before 2020, 5 or 10 years ago, in which India could maintain decent ties with both the United States and with China, and build a kind of a military, or continue to build its military with relatively high-end equipment from Russia. I think that would be India's preference. That's based on interests, but also an expression of underlying ideology. In India's preferred world, or at least the preferred world I think of India's current leadership, is one of multipolarity, not of joining an American team or partnership to counterbalance China, not of joining a Western or liberal world order and reinforcing that or championing that or taking it on as its own, but one of going its own way. And I think India's been pretty clear about that, and particularly this leadership, including the foreign minister. And so I think Americans should listen when Indian leaders talk. I think Americans should listen to what they have to say and recognize that what we're seeing here is a shift born of interest, Indian interest, not values.
I don't want to deflect from your article in the least, but at this point, it might be apt to put to you very briefly an argument made again in Foreign Affairs by Ashley Tellis, talking specifically about China. He said, America has been for 2 decades courting India as a bulwark against China. That's why it's been investing in this relationship. But he added, it is now, in 2022, 2023, becoming clear that India certainly wants American support and assistance vis-a-vis its own problem with China, but India is very unlikely to extend its support vis-a-vis America's problem with China, and he specifically talked about Taiwan. Do you share that concern as well?
I do. And I think that in a way, Ashley's sort of pointing out the obvious. And I don't mean that in any bad way. What I'm saying is, I think what he's suggesting is that Americans who over anticipate Indian support have missed what India has been telling us. And I think it's caution. He's sounding a note of caution to certainly Americans. And I work with some of these in the policy world, maybe particularly at the Pentagon, but they're elsewhere as well. And they have made certain assumptions that if they work with India, if they practice military exercises with India, if they provide India or sell India more weapons, if we further link up our militaries, if we have high-level meetings, if we found groups like the Quad and so on, that we will eventually see something that emerges that basically is an alliance with India. And an alliance with India naturally suggests that India will do things with and for the United States because they're good for the United States and good for the alliance, not just because they serve India's narrowest national interests. But Ashley is suggesting, no. Recognize that India draws clear lines here, and that India will certainly partner with the United States in areas of India's interest. And where U.S. interests also align with Indian interests, India will be on board for those as well. And so, yes, India will work with the United States to help defend its border against Chinese aggression, say, along the LAC. That's an American interest as well. We don't want to see India bullied along the LAC. We don't want to see any third countries bullied by the Chinese or intimidated in ways that extend Chinese influence internationally. So we'll work with India on that. But on Taiwan or other contingencies where it's really American interests at stake and where India doesn't feel the same concern, India won't act. And as I say, some of that is obvious. I don't think India has been telling us otherwise. I think this is kind of a reaction to the over-enthusiasm that Ashley has been hearing in certain quarters in the United States, and a correction for that for American audiences.
Dr. Markey, let's come at this point to the consequences and implications of your view that the India-US relationship is not really based upon shared values, but it is based upon shared convenience and shared interests. And you make 2-3 very important points in your foreign affairs essay. First, you say the United States should think twice, for example, before approving a proposal General Electric put forward earlier this year to co-produce and transfer US technology to India for advanced fighter jet engines. Now, as far as I know, and this seems to be the belief on your side as well, that deal is likely to go through in the next day or so. So if it does go through, would you say it's a fundamental mistake on the part of the Biden administration?
Well, I'd say I'm worried about it. I'm worried about this deal. When we say it'll go through, I think you're absolutely right. It will certainly be announced, or it almost certainly will be announced. All rumors suggest so. So I understand that reality. There are many steps along the way before something this big and this important is actually realized. And so I think there will be a number of questions raised. I think the U.S. Congress will have hearings and so on. This isn't a one and done kind of arrangement, and it will take years to come to fruition in any event. But my argument about the GE engine deal is kind of takes 2 steps. The first argument is simply, why can't the United States and India just continue to focus on what I would consider to be the easy stuff first? Now, there are a lot of immediate needs that India faces militarily that are relatively less high end in terms of technology, less sensitive, less long term, would have an immediate consequence, for instance, for India's ability to defend itself along the LAC or in the Indian Ocean against China. Why not focus on those things? And so here, for instance, I have no problem. There's another sale being talked about, which is the MQ-9 surveillance or attack drones that the United States intends to sell India. I think this is a good idea. I think that this is, I'm not opposed to the United States selling equipment to India that will enable India to defend itself against China immediately. And the Reaper deal, I think, will do that. And so I support it. But the GE engine deal is a very big deal, and it won't have consequences for India's defense capabilities in the very near term. This is a long-term deal that will have to come together over years. And it's a very big deal, as Indian and American leaders even describe it. It's the kind of thing the United States really doesn't do for anyone, hasn't done for even most of its closest allies, and would have to seriously contemplate whether it would make sense even for treaty allies. So why are we jumping ahead, I think, based on the assumption that India will be such a close partner in the next 5 to 25 to 30 years when there is evidence to suggest that our worldviews may differ in that time frame? Why jump ahead to those big ticket, very ambitious projects, which I would say have some potential downside, which is the sharing of some of America's best technology. And the question being, what will India do with that technology where we have question marks? Why not resolve some of the question marks first and then get to sharing that kind of technology?
Many of the question marks that you addressed earlier in this interview are the basis of that letter that was sent by, I believe, 75 senators and members of the House of Representatives to President Biden. Now, if the General Electric deal is to go through, it needs a nod from Congress. Could these question marks actually be an obstacle in Congress, and might Congress be unwilling to clear this deal?
It's conceivable. I don't think that one deal, even this deal, even though it's a big deal, is the thing that will determine the fate of U.S.-India relations. So I don't want to fall on that sword alone. I do, because I do see the political realities as they exist right now. And right now, India continues to be very popular in the United States. There's a bipartisan consensus that favors closer ties with India, and I think isn't going to dissipate immediately on the basis of anything in particular. And I think there are, as I say, good strategic reasons why the United States wants to work with India. So, when framed in those terms, I think the GE engine deal is likely to go through. Even there will be some congressional questioning, perhaps along the lines that I've outlined. I hope so. But this isn't the last of the efforts to work with India, and I think this will be a continuing debate going forward, and I hope so.
Now, the second point you make is about intelligence sharing. You're right. India's uncertain commitment to democratic principles is also why Washington will never be able to share intelligence with New Delhi in the way it does with its so-called Five Eyes partners. In other words, what you're saying is an arm's distance is required on that critical issue.
Yeah, look, the Five Eyes arrangement is to share intelligence is unusual. It is between the United States and allies. With countries that are allies, that say they want to be allies. India does not say that. India explicitly says that it does not seek an alliance with the United States. Five Eyes members are also liberal democracies. They buy into what that means. They buy into that organizing principle in terms of the way they do their politics at home and the way that they pursue politics internationally. To be clear, lest people suggest that we're all very hypocritical. Yes, we're all very hypocritical. The United States is hypocritical. All of the members of the Five Eyes, none of us lives up to our principles in full, but they're still aspirations. And we take seriously the notion that we're supposed to try to live up to them, even if we fail, and we continue to fail repeatedly. And that's a difference. Both of those things are differences with India. Allies like the Five Eyes are trusted with things by the United States that strategic partners are not trusted with. And that means that we expect our allies to come to the defense of the United States, and they expect us to come to their defense. And India does not yet fall into that category and doesn't seem to have any desire to fall into that category. And so, I think in the category of things that we should define as being out of bounds for a strategic partnership, but in bounds for a formal alliance, are things like tight intelligence cooperation, like the Five Eyes. I think that's an important distinction to draw.
Today's pink papers in India suggest that the Indian government will make a request of the Biden administration to include India in the critical minerals alliance that America is putting together. Do you think that is something that should be permitted, or do you think for the very reasons you have reservations about sharing intelligence, maybe critical minerals also should not be part of the agenda?
Well, look, I think I'd have to look at the details on that, and I frankly I haven't. But this is a part of a broader set of issues, as I understand it, having to do with diversification of important inputs to our domestic economy. And right now, things like critical minerals are things that many of us are dependent upon China for. And so the issue here is not so much to create, like the Five Eyes, to create a very small group of incredibly highly trusted partners. But I think it's to recognize that right now we're all a bit vulnerable to the Chinese, and that we need to find alternative options for supply. And that might include a much wider variety of partners. So no, I'm not sure that those two things fall in the same category, but as I say, I'll look into it.
Now, you do make a third point, and perhaps that third point will worry Mr. Modi and his party particularly. You write, Washington needs to cease endorsing Modi's BJP. And then, very importantly, you add, the Biden administration should write and publish more reports that accurately depict India's record on human rights, freedoms, and democratic practices. That, if it happens, would annoy Mr. Modi enormously.
Yeah, I know it won't be popular. No state, no leader of any state likes being criticized, including the United States. But frankly, the United States is criticized all the time. And I think at some level, the Biden administration itself accepts the criticism of the flaws of America's democracy. And it does so and accepts the idea that we're hypocritical, that we don't ourselves live up to the highest standards that we suggest should be lived up to in terms of human rights at home and in terms of our behavior abroad. And the Biden administration, I think, at least I hope, and many of us in the United States accept that we can and ought to do better in the way that we behave. What we shouldn't do is try to silence that criticism. We should listen to it, and we should deal with it. And that's part of our obligation of actually accepting these ideals. And so, frankly, if India is a democracy, I think it needs to live up to that, at least that standard of not silencing the criticism, of listening to it and taking it on board. Shouldn't have such a thin skin that it can't accept that it too can deal with these challenges in a better way. And I think, from a U.S. perspective and from a practical perspective, honesty on these concerns is definitely the best policy. And I say this not just because I think honesty is good, which I do, but I think it's because American leaders should want Indian leaders and the Indian public to know what we think. Because I think that hiding our true feelings about what's happening in India, our concerns about developments in India, will ultimately be misleading. And if we hide our concerns until they get so great that we have to actually take action, or that we feel that we are being pulled apart in terms of the bilateral relationship, that would be far worse. That would risk some kind of a rupture down the line between the United States and India, and India would rightly feel that the United States hadn't been candid about these concerns. I think candor here will ultimately be practically and in a values sense, a smarter policy.
Well, clearly, you would want and expect President Biden to raise these concerns when he meets Mr. Modi. But would you go as far as the Washington Post? Because in an editorial comment on the 17th, the paper said, and the president must do so publicly.
Look, I don't know that the meeting with a prime minister by the United States is the best opportunity to scold him or his country. That's not the reason why you invite a prime minister to Washington, D.C. So I understand that reality. My understanding is that the Biden administration would like to keep its criticism in private. Fine. Here's where I would draw the line. I don't think that scolding is necessary, but neither do I think that celebrating Modi as an individual or as a politician or as a friend of the White House is necessary either. I think celebrating a relationship with India that serves both American and Indian purposes is the point of a state visit. I think there's a lot of symbolism that goes along with that. I think that there's a lot of, as I say, there are a lot of wonderful things that the United States and India can do together. And when the prime minister comes, he's not just a man or a politician, he's a symbol of India. And so therefore deserves to be celebrated. But I do think that we have to be careful politically. And so, for instance, having a big party for Narendra Modi on the White House lawn when he arrives will have political implications back at home in India. And I have some concerns about that. I don't think we need to play up the personal side of the relationship. I don't think big bear hugs and backslaps are necessary. I think we don't need to personify this relationship. I think we should always talk about the US-India relationship. I think we should talk about all of the wonderful opportunities that the United States and India and Americans and Indians have, but not make it about Narendra Modi.
We're coming to the end of this interview, Dr. Markey, but I can't end without quoting the following two sentences. And I think they are the last two sentences of your essay. The United States must treat India as it treats Jordan, Vietnam, and any number of other illiberal partners. It must, in other words, cooperate with India on the reality of shared interests, not on the hope of shared values. Equating India with Jordan and Vietnam will bristle with Mr. Modi.
Yeah, and let me be clear. India is no Jordan or Vietnam in terms of size or scale or importance in the world. I don't want to be misunderstood on that. Anybody who suggests that, I think, is in a way willfully misinterpreting this. What I think the point here is we do a lot, we, the United States, do a lot to cooperate with both Jordan and Vietnam these days. And we do so in spite of the fact that they are very clearly not democratic. And so, we can do a lot with India, even though it's maybe a faltering democracy or an eroding democracy. And so we can find lots of constructive ways to work with lots of different partners. And that's the connection that I was trying to draw, not to suggest that India is a small or less powerful country like these two.
Now, there is, in fact, a more important corollary that arises out of those two sentences. If the US should cooperate with India on the reality of shared interests, not on the hope of shared values, what happens when those interests diverge and are no longer shared? At that point, I take it, the relationship could change, perhaps pretty dramatically.
Yeah, it's conceivable. But for now, we have this unifying and shared concern about China. I think it's important. We can imagine a shift happening there. We can imagine, for instance, India sometimes voices concerns about a G2 world of the United States and China coming back together. We can imagine Narendra Modi making his peace, a separate peace with Xi Jinping. But neither of these seems all that plausible to me at the moment. And so I think we have a pretty solid but interest-based foundation for our partnership in the near term.
So to sum up, correct me if I'm wrong, what your essay is doing is sounding a note of caution to Washington, perhaps even a warning. Don't overestimate the basis of the relationship with India by believing that you share values and principles and beliefs. See it as a convergence of convenience, see it as a matter of shared interest. And while those interests remain common, you can build a lot on the relationship. But bear in mind that when those interests diverge, and that may not happen for quite a while, but when they do, the relationship will automatically change as well.
Karan, I think you've got it exactly right. Americans need to be careful about making false assumptions about U.S.-India convergence as being natural and necessary and the way of the world or the fate of the world. This relationship could go in a different direction. I hope it doesn't, but we need to be alive to that possibility.
Dr. Markey, thank you very much for explaining in detail that essay in foreign affairs, because I know it will create ripples in my country, particularly as Prime Minister Modi reaches the White House later today. Thank you very much indeed.
Well, thank you. It's been a real pleasure.
Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch The Interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me.